So welcome to this short webinar on dynamic flexibility and mobilization. And what we're going to attempt to do here is take a quick look at some of the science behind why at cor-kinetic we think dynamic flexibility and mobilization is a really, really important thing. Often we look at flexibility as a property of the anatomy. We look at it in terms of passive, what happens within a muscle itself. And what we want to try and do here is look a little bit more about some of the neural aspects and how that may then tie into taking a more dynamic approach to flexibility and mobilization and being task appropriate and task dependent in terms of the muscular response. And we're very much thinking about the system as an active system. And we're going to look at some of the mechanisms behind that. I don't want this webinar to be too long because I know that people can get bored. And we are going to kind of take a quick look at the science as it says. It's not going to be an in-depth webinar on, deep muscle architecture or physiology, etc. We're just going to try and get the most pertinent points and talk about them. So what we're going to first look at is just how we view flexibility. So simply, I think we need to view flexibility not just as structural, but also as nervous system based. Now, one of the main aims that we're trying to do often with things like static stretching is stretch a muscle, and with dynamic mobilization, you're trying to stretch a muscle as well. But you're kind of thinking about it in very different ways and you're trying to do it in some different ways as well. And we're shifting focus away from the muscle and a little bit more towards the nervous system and more towards the motor system and the motor system's response to the task or to the stretch. And taking it away from maybe how we view the muscle and the passive properties of the muscle. So we, thinking about collagen and all those other things and making them longer and making them have a better resting length, which might affect posture, etc., etc. But instead of that, we're trying to think about some of the feed forward and feedback mechanisms that might enable us to have a better response to the task. And very much we're going to start to think about flexibility as task dependent. Now, as I said before, often we think about length. I want a longer muscle. A longer muscle is a better muscle. And often we don't think about stretchiness. So when I said a longer muscle is a better muscle, I think that's often a way that we start to think about flexibility. We want we want a muscle at a better resting length. And if I stretch it, I want it to have a better resting length. Now, I'm not so bothered about a muscle's resting length, actually. I think I would much prefer it to be able to have the right amount of stretchiness or be able to increase and decrease its stiffness actively according to the task. So stiffness is a property of an elastic thing to resist deformation. So if I want to do a big long stride, I would probably want my stiffness to decrease. If I wanted to move very quickly or hit something a little hard, say like a tennis shot, for example, I might want to increase my stiffness, which may allow me to move quicker. It may allow me to have shorter, sharper, snappier ranges of movement. It might allow me to transfer energy a little bit better. We remember if we're much more compliant, then we're going to, kind of dissipate more energy as heat and stuff like that. So our stretchiness, we should be able to actively change that. So rather than just having a better passive length of a muscle, we're actually thinking about the skill of active decrease and increase in stiffness or simply stretchiness. Stretchiness isn't a very scientific word, but I think it explains what we're trying to get at very, very easily. So we want the central nervous system to be able to change that stiffness according to the task because it comes from the active component of the muscle. If I want something to change very, very quickly, then it has to be mediated by the active components, and that's the brain and the descending pathways and the excitation and inhibition of muscular stiffness through the gamma and the alpha motor neuron, etc. And we're going to go into those a little bit more later. But it's very, very much task dependent. Now, one of the things we found out about static stretching is simply it doesn't kind of, it doesn't, so I don't believe it certainly does us any harm. But does it give us benefit? So for something that's done so regularly, I would want it to give me benefit. If we look at gyms and therapists and trainers and everyone's doing it. But does it give us benefit? We see maybe it decreases power. We see it doesn't provide a great deal of injury prevention. And in fact, what we also see is that dynamic and static levels of flexibility don't really correlate with each other. And that makes sense when we start to get into some of the mechanisms behind it. So let me put that into an example. So if I'm a tennis player and I want to move very, very quickly across the court, I might want to increase my stiffness so that I can then move more quickly. You've got to remember, the larger the range of movement sometimes we have, actually the slower we go, you know. If I want to actually reach out to get a ball that's kind of far away and I need a large range of movement, I might want to decrease the stiffness, become more compliant and allow a little bit more range of movement at my joint. If I want to hit a ball very hard, I might want to increase my stiffness again so that, you know, my backswing's a little bit shorter, I'm a little bit stiffer, I'm able to kind of absorb and return energy a little bit better. If you think about stiffness of a spring, if it's very, very compliant, then we lose energy. If it's a little bit stiffer, then we're able to return energy. The real key here is that we're able to change that stiffness. It's not just set, that it's task appropriate. Now, if you think about balancing on a beam, for example, you would want quite a stiff spring stiffness to enable you to have very, very fine control. That these things, if I had large ranges of movement when I was standing on a beam, I wouldn't, you know, be able to control the short little ranges that I would need to balance on a beam. So it's very, very important that we're able to change that stiffness according to the task. So balancing might be one thing. I might be, you know, tennis might be another, running might be another, jumping might be another. That if I want to jump repeatedly, you would definitely have a smaller spring stiffness. That when you land from a jump, you tend to have less knee bend if you want to jump again. Whereas if you want to jump and dissipate the energy, land and dissipate the energy, you'll take a larger knee bend because you don't need to return that energy, you want to absorb it. And that all comes from changes in central nervous system responses to the flexibility that we need. It's an active thing. When we hop on different surfaces, Farley did the study many moons ago, when we hop on different surfaces, actually your stiffness levels are able to remain the same even though the surface stiffness changes. So your energy return is the same. So actually you would need to be able to change the internal stiffness to be able to change, to be able to respond to the external surface stiffness, to be able to keep the energy absorption and return very, very similar. So it's one of these things that we need to think about more on an active sense rather than just a passive sense. Mechanisms I want to talk about that we use to regulate stiffness or flexibility is the muscle spindle. Now, the muscle spindle is kind of seen as a feedback mechanism about the length of a muscle. We also have things like our GTOs, our Golgi tendon organs, that are able to give information back about tension. Now, length and tension are kind of intimately entwined in terms of how they work. You know, as I increase lengthening force on a muscle and maybe my muscle decreases spring stiffness, or increases spring stiffness, then that's going to change tension level as well. So Golgi tendon organ is also very important, and as I said before, intimately entwined with the muscle spindle. But what we're going to talk about today is a little bit more about the muscle spindle, and simply that's because it's also got an active component, which is really, really important. As I said before, we often see flexibility simply as a passive property. And if we look at some stuff like Magnuson's work on stretching, and we realise that, you know, we have sensory feedback mechanisms such as the spindle, well, they kind of turned around and said we don't actually see the passive properties of the muscle changing in terms of stiffness or a decrease in that stiffness as we see changes within the actual flexibility level of the muscle after static stretching. So therefore, those changes in response to, you know, the changes we have in response to that static stretching are actually more to do with the sensory components and the actual muscular components themselves. So we actually have a change in our perception of stretch. Our stretch tolerance changes. Now, there has been other work that's also shown that there are some changes in the passive properties of the muscle. What that really shows us is it's very unclear, like most stuff. But I also think it's very, very interesting, the nervous system aspect, and it kind of fits in with what we're talking about here. So we're going to run with that one. So the muscle spindle gives us feedback in terms of length of a muscle. So what we have to remember is we're able to have afferent and efferent information from a spindle. So although it's a feedback mechanism, we're also actually sending information to the spindle to create change in how we sense feedback. And that's a really, really clever kind of way of having a sensory mechanism. It's not just reporting what's happening. We can actually change the sensitivity of what's happening, so that our feedback changes. An example of that is if I wanted to keep a muscle short and tight, maybe I'd exercised the day before and I had DOMs and I had, whatever, low energy, etc. That decreasing the amount I move by increasing my stiffness or decreasing the amount of flexibility I had would be a really good way of doing that. So what I can actually do is send information down what's called my gamma motor neuron, which actually pulls on the ends of the intrafusal fiber, the actual fibers, the active fibers within the muscle spindle. And what that actually makes is the spindle to become more sensitive. So as I said before, if I was feeling protective, say I'd injured my ankle and I wanted to create a protective response around my ankle, what I might do is create a larger gamma motor neuron drive, and that's called my gamma bias. And actually what that's going to do is create a much more sensitive spindle to stretch. And it's a really, really clever way of adapting and changing the feedback mechanisms and the response that I get to that. So we can change gamma bias, increase intrafusal fiber, the fibers in the middle of the spindle, their tension levels, and that will actually then affect how the extrafusal fibers or the alpha motor neuron controlled fibers, your actual skeletal muscle fibers, respond. And it's a very, very clever system. But what we generally see as is passive, but it's very, very active. And it's very, very active on a really, really millisecond kind of way that it can change so quickly. So it's an active and a passive system. It's efferent and afferent, although often we just talk about the afferent aspects. It just sends information back. No, it actually is actively controlled, and we can change that information that we're getting back according to whatever else is going on. It's a very, very clever system. So we have what's called our 1A primary afferent system, and we have our group 2 secondary afferent, and they're very important because one senses static length, the actual static length, and one actually senses the rate of change of that length, and they both feed into our stretch reflex, which is very, very important because it helps us create really, really millisecond control beyond our conscious control of movement that's going on. So we have rate of change and we have static length. So if you think about a static stretch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold a stretch, and that's going to send a constant stream of information about the static length of a muscle. Now that's important, but more important than that is actually the rate of change, the primary afferent. And you can see how the rate of change is actually the primary afferent rather than the secondary afferent. So the rate of change is the most important thing, and that's if I move quickly. The fibers, the intrafusal fibers are starting to give me information, or the sensory part of the spindle, is starting to give me information about how quickly that's happening. Now, if we want to create a really, really quick response to an action happening, rate of change is going to be a really, really important information to get. Static length may be less important. If we think about static stretching and we're thinking about the kind of anatomy, the local area. Well, actually, if we think about it neurologically, the static length is much, much less important from my perspective than the actual rate of change. Rate of change is the dynamic activity of what is happening. And to create an appropriate motor response to that is very, very important. If I have a very, very, very quick rate of change on my quadriceps muscle, would I want to be able to change the stiffness very, very quickly to control something like knee valgus in an ACL situation, an ACL injury situation? The answer to that would be absolutely. If I'd spent a lot of time static stretching rather than taking my knee through dynamic ranges of movement at different speeds, then I'm not going to be as sensitive to that information coming back. I'm not going to be able to create the appropriate motor responses through my skeletal fibers to become much stiffer and to actually decrease the range of movement that my knee goes through. And as we're seeing from the research, maybe that's a little bit more to do with the hip than it is to do with the knee. But the same thing would be true. As my knee starts to go through some valgusing motion, would I want my hip musculature to be able to sense that and choose an appropriate muscular response to decrease the range of movement? And that's really, really important. That's maybe why what we're starting to see here is it's an appropriate motor pattern and appropriate movements that actually create change, rather than just strength or rather than static length changes that are important. It's much, much more about the active motor control of a specific scenario. So it's very, very important we start to understand these mechanisms, and it's very, very important that we start to think about these mechanisms when we're thinking about techniques to try and create change. And actually having a rate of change and a change in range of movement are very, very important when we're thinking about the neurological components. So it's very important that we have the right, what's called gamma bias, the right tension level for the task within the spindle to be able to, for my system to make the appropriate muscular responses. Now, my gamma motor neuron only actually affects the intrafusal fibers within the spindle itself. My alpha motor neuron actually affects my skeletal muscle fibers, but they are a loop. They're a reflexive loop, and it's very, very important that we can have an effect on both of those things. If we flip to the next page, what we start to see is just some really small charts. Just about how my body responds to different, how all of our bodies respond to some different movements and rate of movement. So as we said before, group 1A primary afferents are rate of change, group 2 secondary afferents are about static length. Now if we look at the first chart to the left, we see a classic reflex thing. If you're a therapist, if you want to test someone's muscular reflex, you're going to get one of those little hammers and you're going to tap on a tendon and you're going to look to see the stretch response. As we see here on the charts below, as we see the sharp tap from the stimulus, the primary response is a much larger response, and the secondary response is very, very small in comparison. You are actually testing the dynamic ability of the spindle to react. Whereas if we static stretch, we're looking much more at the actual change of length rather than the dynamic rate of change. If we go to the second one and we look at the velocity versus the discharge of the spindle, so as we see an increase in the velocity, we see a very, very small discharge in the spindle and the secondary nerve ending, whereas as we see an increase in the velocity, we see a much larger primary discharge there in the purple, and we see that real incline in terms of the plot on the graph. And again, if we were to just statically stretch, we wouldn't really see a very, very large primary response. What we might see is kind of a small incline, and then we wouldn't see any more change after that as we hold that stretch. So it's very, very important that if we think about the sensitivity of our proprioceptors and our muscular and motor responses, that they have to be trained, they have to be sensitive. If we think about pain, the more we're in pain, the more sensitive we become to pain. If we think about movement, the more we practice movement, the more sensitive we are to that movement. So they're really, really important things. And if we flip to the last one, what we can see there is again two different rates of change. So the first one is a smaller slope, the second one is a a much sharper slope. And again, if we look at the blue under A, if we look at the blue graph under A, we see that increase in primary fiber discharge, not so much in secondary fiber. And again, if we look at B, we see a really marked increase over the plot of the graph where we're seeing an increase in rate of change there again. So it's really, really important we think about both. So if you think about a protective system and we create a very, very sharp rate of change, you're actually going to probably get a very, very sharp motor response. So it's important that we don't just think about dynamic movement as just being more dynamic is better. It's appropriate to what someone is able to help. And sometimes static stretching can be important. Other times we might need to think about dynamic stretching, but at different velocities, because that's going to provide a different kind of response back from the motor system. So if we think about gamma and alpha co-activation, which is the stretch reflex, we have to start to think about the appropriate response to the task, and that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. So if my gamma bias, my intrafusal fiber is set very, very tight, very, very sensitive, only a small lengthening of that fiber will produce a shortening of my muscle fiber. That's because simply, my muscle doesn't want to lengthen like that. My muscle wants to stay within the range of movement that my intrafusal fiber is set. So the gamma motor neuron and the alpha motor neuron have this reflexive co-activation. The stretch reflex is positive that it's a protective mechanism, but also it's a subconscious mechanism to allow us to move. So if I put my foot into the ground and I go into dorsiflexion, it's gonna the stretch reflex as part of a motor program is actually going to respond and then create a change and shorten a muscle so that I get a lengthening and a shortening. And we see that often in sport and in lots of activities. A tennis shot, a golf shot are all about change from a lengthening to a shortening. But what we want is the appropriate response to a specific task. As I said before, if I've rolled my ankle and injured my ankle, my response is often going to be that my spindle gain is set very, very tight, so that even the smallest amount of movement may set off a protective response of the muscle. Now, that would be positive, as we talked about before with balancing on a beam. That's going to be positive because it allows me very, very fine motor control. It's the ability to switch that on and switch it off, which is important. What we know from looking at things like the neuromatrix and some of Lorimer Moseley's work is that we have the brain, and the brain outputs sensory and motor responses to protect. Sensory response to protect would be pain or increase in sensation. Now, a motor response to protect is often just a decreased range of movement to protect that tissue from from harm, if you like. So it's important that we're able to change that activity appropriate to the task. And often after injury, we see rigidity and we are unable to create that change. Now, a dynamic mobilization is creating low-level movement that both the afferents are able to interpret as non-threatening and therefore create the appropriate motor response. If the muscle fiber is too loose, we may see less fine motor control, less sensitivity, less reflex activity. If I'm jumping and landing and don't want my knee to go through valgus, that might be an important thing to have, that I have quick activation of the muscle. We see delayed activation of the glutes, or we see the reduced EMG activation of the glutes at that situation. So that's a decrease in appropriate response. So if the muscle spindle is set in too tight, too short is probably the wrong word, but the shortness would be in terms of how much more movement it can take. So actually the spindle gain would be longer. I've written that wrongly on my PowerPoint. The spindle gain would be longer, but the amount of movement would be much shorter to create the same response. So it'd be too sensitive. We'd see a decreased movement. We'd see quick reflexive activity. So again, if I had a limp or a spasm, that would often be driven by a spindle that wasn't able to lengthen. Whereas we might see, with a lack of control, we might see a gamma bias that's actually too baggy, if you like. There's too much movement before we actually get the appropriate motor response that we want. So these things are really, really important to look at and to understand. If we look over to the other side, we see that these are the gamma motor neuron responses to an extension of a muscle. So when we stimulate the static fiber, again, we see much less discharge because we have a gamma motor neuron that affects the static fibers, and we have a gamma motor neuron that has an effect on the dynamic group 1A fiber. So as we can again see that the stimulation of the dynamic fiber corresponds with the rate of change of a situation. So kind of isometric holding or static length or static shortness changes aren't going to affect the dynamic fiber response. They aren't going to affect my motor system response. And that's why movement is so very, very important, and appropriate movement. Appropriate to the speeds and the tasks and the tensions and the ranges that I desire. They become part of a motor pattern. So this, the first diagram is just simply extrafusal and intrafusal fiber relationship, as we explained. The second graph is about how the actual gamma motor neuron discharges efferently according to the situation that's occurring. And as I said before, this is a really, really simple explanation. There's much better people out there about muscle physiology and muscle neuromuscular responses, but I think it's important to put it in the appropriate context of how we start to affect people in terms of what we do. So if we flip to the next page, and we are actually getting to the end of this now, I hope you're not too bored. So we also have to think about all this information coming back up to the brain. So all our proprioceptive information feeds back to the brain, through my cerebellum, which can use it to make appropriate fine motor control responses, back up into my sensory cortex, and obviously we're going to use that sensory cortex information to create motor information. So all our proprioceptors, which a muscle spindle would be part of, are feeding back to the brain, and the brain will have corresponding neurons to those proprioceptors that are being affected, and we do things like create changes within our sensory and motor maps according to the feedback and the feed forward that we give them. So as we practice movement, as we send information back to the brain from movement and create appropriate gamma motor neuron bias or muscle tension relationships, then we neurons that fire together wire together. We create motor, neural and sensory patterns that become our default. And when we have good default, then that allows us to kind of do what we need to do when we need to do it. So what we also have to remember is that our higher brain centers actually can modify the reflex. So lots of reflexes are based around the spinal cord, and that's really, really cool because the delay time that it takes to get back to the brain, say we have a muscle and it sends information back to the brain via the spinal cord, we're talking like about 50 milliseconds. And that can be too long sometimes to take an appropriate response. So what we have is the information goes back to the spinal cord, to the lower motor neuron, and then it fires information back out and creates an appropriate alpha response. And what's really important about that is it decreases the latency. It decreases the amount of time that we need to do stuff. But that doesn't kind of mean that it's disconnected from the higher centers. So via inhibitory and excitatory impulses, the brain is able to change the spindle gain, change what happens in the lower, the kind of sub cortical areas. And what that does is it allows us to get over that gain problem, but without divorcing it from control from the higher centers. So it's a very, very, very clever system. And again, this is a lot to do with habit. So what we're trying to do through dynamic movement, what we're trying to do through mobilization is alter the default setting. We're trying to recalibrate. We're trying to change the habit, the response of that spindle to the movement. As I said before, that my default setting after I roll my ankle may be a kind of spasmodic one. It may be to protect the ankle through not going through range of movement to, protect the ligament or to protect the muscle from tearing. And that's a real positive in terms of time for tissue healing. But it's not such a positive when those motor responses become a habit after the time of tissue healing has gone. And we see that with lots and lots of injury. And Paul Hodges has done some great work into this. Deborah Faller's done some great work into it, where we're looking at motor responses after pain. And a lot of this is going to be set through the feedback mechanisms. We're altering default tension that then become habit. The more we drive a neural pattern, the stronger that neural pattern becomes. It becomes a neurotag. Now, pain can become attached to a neurotag. A motor response can become attached to a neurotag. But mostly it becomes a habit. Most of what happens in the brain is driven by habit. Our emotional responses, our motor responses, our pain responses, all these different things. And again, variability is such an important thing that can happen within the brain. So in terms of dynamic movement, what we're looking to do is provide low-level graded exposure into the system to change habit. If you think about that primary afferent, if I then take the ankle and start hopping and jumping up and down on it, massive rate of changes, big tensional changes on the Golgi tendon organ, the sensory system is going to be screaming. It's going to create appropriate motor responses to protect. But it's important that we don't just forget that those primary afferent movements are very, very important, that we need a graded exposure so that the system is able to recalibrate and we can grade the program appropriately, but also create actual changes within that program so we get progression, so we get graded progression in impact on the sensory systems. And what we're looking to do is create appropriate changes within the spindle. So as I said before, why might we see this change? Pain, but also decreased exposure. So if we become protective over a body part, we stop using it, we stop moving it, we start moving something else more, that area does not get exposed to movement. Therefore, its appropriate response to this strange movement that comes across, that it's not used to, is to create protection. Whereas if we can have low-level increased exposure in body areas that don't usually get that exposure, hopefully we're going to kind of bring in a change in habit and recalibrate our motor responses and hopefully also our sensory responses to an area. Because if we have motor responses, we also might have sensory responses that are tied into rate of change on a primary 1A afferent. So what do we need to do? How do we put all this information into context? Well, we have to start to think about exposure to areas of our body, to multiple ranges of movement, to speeds, different planes of movement, to different movement skills, to different movements within themselves. We're looking to change skill. Skill is much, much more important to me than lengthening or strengthening. And we're moving again our perspective away from simple, the periphery, the localized physical aspect of the muscle, and also thinking about how the physiology interacts with the neurology as well. For me, low-level movement tasks start to affect that. Then what we're going to start to do is increase that into higher-level movement tasks. If I'm thinking about movement and I'm thinking about movement pattern and creating length, I also want to do that in the context of moving lots of different things together. If I move more things together, again, I get neurons that fire together and they wire together. I get appropriate ranges of movement from different parts of my body. I think a really, really great way to dissipate energy and to summate energy is to use a lot of different parts of my body a little bit rather than use a few parts of my body a lot. And on a really, really simple level, and I think simplicity is really important, that we need to think about the architecture and the physiology and how that interacts with the neurology in terms of things like dynamic versus static stretching. Static stretching isn't bad, but it's only thinking about the physiology and the change in length. It's not thinking about the stretchiness, the rate of change, the appropriateness to a muscle, to a motor pattern. It's not thinking about sensitivity of the primary feedback mechanisms within the muscle. I really hope you've enjoyed this. It's kind of just some musings on thinking about what we know about neurology and physiology and what we know about movement and how we can tie those things in together with some scientifically plausible mechanisms. I think we need much, much more research in the areas of dynamic stretching and how they impact on performance and how they impact on pain and how they impact on motor changes. I don't think we have that. In the meantime, I think we need to just start to discuss some very plausible scientific mechanisms that allow us to create some techniques that might be slightly more beneficial for people.